Next, we have the identity property. The way I remember the identity property is I think of it as whatever I start with is what I end up with. And you'll see that in both of the examples in front of you. I start with A, I end up with A when I add. I start with A, I end up with A when I multiply. So a little trick to help you remember this one is think about identity means who you are. If you look in the mirror, you see yourself. So looking in the mirror, you always see yourself. So what you start with is what you end with. That's the identity property. Just a little trick to help you remember. So any number plus 0 always gives you that number. Any number times 1 always gives you that number. So that's the identity property of addition and multiplication. Let's look at some examples. So in our first example, we have 5x minus 6 in parentheses, and we're adding that to 0 equals 5x minus 6. So what did we start with and end up with is the same. We started with 5x minus 6 and we ended up with 5x minus 6. So is this the identity property of addition or of multiplication? This one's of addition, because if you look at our property, a plus 0 equals a, 5x minus 6 becomes our a, plus 0 equals a. Next example, we have negative 3m times 1 equals negative 3m. So what did we start with and end with here? We started with negative 3m and we ended with negative 3m. And we're multiplying times 1, so is this of addition or of multiplication? This is of multiplication. The next property we have is the multiplicative property of 0. And this is a really easy property to remember because it means whenever you multiply something times 0, you get 0, which we all know. So here I'm multiplying in my basic rule with the algebra. I'm showing any number times 0 equals 0. So any number times 0 equals 0. And in my example, I have 3x times 0 equaling 0. So that one's pretty easy. So if you end up with 0, if you have some number times 0 and you end up with 0, that's the multiplicative property of 0. In our next example, we have the opposite property, which is also referred to as the additive inverse. So this year I'll refer to it as both to help you think in terms of opposite property. When you get into algebra and later you'll hear additive inverse. Inverse properties are properties that undo each other. So we think about subtraction undoing addition and division undoing multiplication. We also learned that square rooting and squaring undo each other. Those are inverse operations. So that's what they mean by additive inverse or inverse operations. So if we're going to work with the additive inverse, that means what do we add together to cancel each other out? Well, we know that if we add opposites together, they cancel each other out. So the property is n plus negative n equals 0, or opposite signs of the same number added together give you 0. That's why I call it the opposite property. Opposite signs of the same number added together give you 0. So we have negative 6 plus 6 is 0. 2x plus negative 2x equals 0. The additive inverse property. And we will be using this property frequently when we work with equations. Now we have the reciprocal property, which is also referred to as multiplicative inverse. The reciprocal property states that whenever you multiply two numbers together that equal 1, those two numbers are reciprocals or multiplicative inverses. So any number over 1 times 1 over that number will give you 1. So for example, and we saw this with fractions, negative 3 over 1 times negative 1 over 3 gives you 1 because negative times negative is positive. Negative 3 times negative 1 is 3. 1 times 3 is 3. So that ends up giving you 1. Negative 2/3 times negative 3/2 gives you 6 over 6, which equals 1. Now notice all of these give me positive 1. Therefore, what do you think is true about the signs of reciprocals? They have to be the same. So if I have a negative times a negative, that gives me a positive. But if I had a negative times a positive, that would give me a negative. And I'm looking for a positive 1 as my answer with reciprocals. So the reciprocal of negative 3 has to be negative 1/3. So tell me, what is the reciprocal of negative 2/5? If you said negative 5/2, you are correct. What is the reciprocal of 4? If you said 1/4, you are correct. Reciprocals always multiply to equal 1.